Bé, molt bon dia. Gràcies per venir en un dia complicat. Benvingudes i benvinguts a l'Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern. Una qüestió pràctica primer, l'horari d'acabament. Estarem aquí fins a les 13:30, ho dic perquè tothom es pugui fer una idea. I hi haurà una pausa a les 11, o sigui que tindrem ocasió de relaxar-nos també. Amb cafè. Molt bé. We are about to start a seminar on asymmetry. As you know, asymmetric federalism is a classic area of study. Besides, in some with the principle of equality. And now it's expected that it will manage diversity. I remember, well, I'm sorry, I mean, that's the kind I remember one of my predecessors, Ferran Requejo, quoting Antoni Gaudí, the well-known architect. Symmetry, said Gaudí, is a virtue of lazy people because thanks to symmetry, they only have to think half of the time. It is not our case. In this seminar, Professor Popelier from Antwerp University is going to provide a general perspective on the relationship of asymmetry with federal constitutionalism. After her presentation, we are going to deal with particular cases. The first one, Italy, with Professor Saputelli, CNR, Institut Massimo Severo Giannini, will enlighten us on the notion of differentiated autonomy that is included in the Italian constitution and a matter of present debates. After her speech, it will return of Professor Fassi from the Universitat de Corse. We have asked him to present some of the exceptions to the French centralized model. Finally, Professor Anderson, Liverpool John Moores University, will explain the details of the devolution process in the UK. Different views on different constitutional or legal strategies to manage diversity, and an opportunity to learn from experts. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Maybe can give you another microphone?
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. And I was asked to tell you a bit more about constitutional asymmetry, and we've been doing quite some research about it. Let me start with what can be called the paradox of constitutional asymmetry. And the paradox is that constitutional asymmetry helps to make multinational systems stable. And at the same time, it carries the seed to make them unstable. And that is why it gets quite a bit of critique. Actually, it's the same as the paradox of federalism. We have that paradox saying, well, regional autonomy helps to make multinational systems stable, and at the same time, it also carries the seed to make them unstable. Well, I think the reason is that when it's used for multinational systems, well, multinational systems are unstable, or more, or less stable than homogeneous systems are, so it will always be a bit fragile. But let's see what critique is. What is said is that the risks in constitutional asymmetry, meaning that some entities have more powers or better statute, more say in central decision making than other entities, raises the specter of comparison. The ones that are left behind are going to compare, and they want more as well. And so there is a constant fight to get the better position. And if not, you'll have inequality. So constitutional asymmetry leads to inequality, to competition, and to complexity. Now, if multinational systems are, by definition, more unstable than other systems, and if there is a desire, nevertheless, to keep the system together, then the question is, how can we find a structure that maintains some sense of belonging while respecting regional identities? That is actually the big question that every political system has. And federalism is one of those things, and then the way you arrange federalism all depends on that question. So, what is constitutional asymmetry? What are we talking about? It is not the same as political asymmetry. Political asymmetry means that you find variety between territorial entities in the size of population, of wealth, economic geography, identitarian features, or political landscape. And if you have that, you can also find constitutional asymmetry, but not always. You can have political asymmetry and not constitutional asymmetry. Constitutional asymmetry is the more legal side. It means the way you're going to structure the country is in a way that there are differences between the territorial entities. They have more status, they have more powers, or better fiscal arrangements than others, or less. So, 3 dimensions: status, more or less institutional autonomy, so the capacity to organize their own institutions, and more or less representation in central level institutions. Powers, that means differences in the allocation of powers. They can have broader or more narrow competences. There is more or less control by the federal authorities, or there is a possibility for some entities to opt in or opt out. And fiscal arrangements, how many taxing powers they have, revenue powers, spending capacity, reliance on transfers, etc. Well, I'm not going to say too much about the UK, because we'll have that. But this is something that you find in the UK, where you have like a more or less constitutional guarantee and self-organization in one entity, more powers in some entities, more fiscal autonomy in Scotland, so it varies. And then the question is why? Why do we have it? Why do we have constitutional asymmetry? If it's so risky, why do we find it so prevalent around the world? And we've done some research into it. And what we found is that non-multinational systems do not have constitutional asymmetry. Now, if you look at federal studies, it is very, very much inspired by and tailored to the US. It's as if, well, become a federal system means become the USA. But if we more generally look at multi-tiered systems, we find that the traditional federal systems, the model states, what they have in common is homogeneity and thus symmetry. You do find it also in unitary systems, so-called unitary systems that are also layered because they have overseas territories, and the overseas territories will have a specific status. But you do find it in multinational systems. Not all multinational systems, but many. It's a common feature. It's not always present, but you find it very often. So there must be something in it. If you have a multinational system, there must be something that's attractive in constitutional asymmetry. Now, we did some research into it, and what we found was that political asymmetry in itself is not a precondition for constitutional asymmetry. You can have political asymmetry and not have constitutional asymmetry. What we did find was that identity, so the identitarian variety in the country, that is what a multinational system is a catalyst. It's not in itself what is going to bring forward constitutional asymmetry, but it is a catalyst if it is combined with the fact that there is no dominant group or no authoritarian central authority who wants things to happen their own way all over the country, or if it is combined with a difference in wealth, history, or when you have separatist threats. That's when you find constitutional asymmetry. Now, about the importance of identity. What can you do if you have like specific national groups? There are different ways to treat it. Sometimes privileged status or power is given to national groups converging with territorial entities. So these national groups have their own territorial entity and they get a specific status. Sometimes you can find it in combination with territorial entities. It's what we find, for example, in Belgium, where we have different territorial entities that converge more or less with national groups, but not entirely. But when you look at a central level, how this is organized and who is involved and who gets a say is not the territorial entities, but the national groups, the language groups, and not all of them, just the two major ones, and the Flemings and the French-speaking. And in some countries, privileged status is given to national groups over territorial entities. For example, in Ethiopia, where you see the sort of federal chamber is not a representation of the territorial entities, but of the national groups. Yeah, that's what I was just saying. That's just an example from Belgium. Now, sometimes you also find a way from constitutional asymmetry evolving into constitutional symmetry. We've seen that in South Africa, in Russia, and in Nigeria. And in these cases, that was a very deliberate choice to break with the past, because what they found was that constitutional asymmetry was bringing the country apart. In Russia, it was called a system of wild federalism. Now, that had much to do with the fact that the one that decided over who got which autonomy, the one that negotiated on that was the president, with each territorial entity alone. And so what you got was a lot of decentralization, which is not really the spirit of Russia today. But we've seen the same in South Africa, Nigeria. What we also see is that constitutional symmetry in divided systems also has its disadvantages. It may privilege the dominant national group. If one national group is dominant all over and everyone has the same powers, that means that this national group will remain very dominant. And if you look, I'm sorry, but again to UK, what you see is what a report of a select committee on the constitution was saying. And there was some talk like, wait now, these different, these devolved entities, they have their own parliament, and we don't. The English do not. There is this British parliament that is saying what we need to do, and the others have the say in it. But we don't have to say in their parliament. So, and the report said, well, establishing an English parliament would crystallize England's relative strength, because this is the dominant group already, and this way destabilize the union. So, if constitutional asymmetry is an important feature of many multinational systems, and at the same time it brings the risk of instability, the question is, how can we organize constitutional asymmetry in such a way that these risks are reduced? And my hypothesis, and we need some more research into that, but my hypotheses are that the scope of asymmetry matters, but also the process matters. And my point of view is a bit of a broader theory about federalism, looking at multi-tiered systems, systems that have multiple levels of authority. We call it a federal system if, according to Stephen Tierney's theory, it is based on a federal contract. This is what I mean. Multi-tiered systems are always in search of a constitutionally defined, but always contested balance between cohesion and autonomy. And what you usually find in federalism literature is only autonomy. And if you only look at autonomy and you're afraid that autonomy will destabilize the country, what you find is the way to centralization. Now, cohesion here is not the same as centralization. Centralization means that there is a dominance of a central authority at the cost of autonomy. Cohesion does not have to go the cost of autonomy, but it means that what remains central is done in a very cohesive way, taking everyone along and trying to find, with respect of everyone, trying to find some common sense. And this is what multi-tiered systems do. They make a choice in the federal balance between autonomy, more or less autonomy, and cohesion, and they lay that down in their institutions, in the dimension of status, powers, and fiscal arrangements. So what I mean by autonomy is the ability to organize yourself, self-rule, but also shared rule if it comes to securing your own interests in central decision-making. And what I mean by cohesion is securing the integrity of the entire system. With joint decision-making, collective veto means that you have to also talk with the others before taking a position, a loyalty principle, and interregional solidarity. So what I'm saying is that they're not opposites. You can have them both. But the balance can change from system to system and over time. And if you look at this balance, what countries choose to do, they can choose for low, medium, or high cohesion, and they can choose for low, medium, or high autonomy, and then you can have any combination between that. So this goes from very centralized systems on the left to very, very decentralized systems at the right. And the Constitution will say where you are. And according to Tierney, if you want to, a federal contract, it means that you have at least some meaningful autonomy and meaningful cohesion, both. He uses other terminology, but that's what it comes down to. But he doesn't say what meaningful is. So in my view, meaningful means that it has to have at least medium autonomy, at least medium cohesion, to be called a federal contract. But there is still a lot of variety possible there. And I have also developed indicators to measure that, because this only has some meaning if we can actually measure to see where every system is situated. I'm not going to bother you too much with all these indicators. I'm having some examples here in the way that the lawmaking process is done. Does the central government decide alone or not? What powers, how you give powers, etc. I measured this for Belgium. So what I saw was that if we look at the Flemish community where I come from, it's the biggest community, then autonomy is quite high, well, very high. But if you look at the German-speaking community, autonomy is much lower. The German-speaking community consists of 70,000 people. That's less than 1%. So actually, they still have a lot of autonomy, taking that into account. But it's only medium, which means that from the perspective of the Flemish community, in my schedule, we would be a confederation. Medium cohesion, high autonomy. But if you look at the German-speaking community, from their perspective, it's more a regionalized system. Medium cohesion, medium autonomy. And that's also how we can measure the constitutional asymmetry. So in Belgium, there is a constitutional asymmetry of a value of 0.20, from 0 to 1. What does that mean? Is that a lot or not? Well, we have to look at other multi-tiered systems to see whether this is actually high or not. So let us talk a bit about scope. The hypothesis was that the scope of asymmetry matters. One of my PhDs, Lidia Bonifatti, did some research on this, and she measured a whole variety of multinational systems. And what you see here is, and we can discuss whether the categories actually made is actually what we need. But what you can see is that Belgium is, well, actually in the same category as Spain. And it's quite medium. It's not low, but you can have much higher asymmetry. UK is amongst them, so we'll hear a bit more about that. This is how she categorized this. The ones with strong asymmetry, the ones with medium, low, or even no asymmetry. As I said, not all the multinational systems have constitutional asymmetry. There was some discussion about the UK, though, and it all depends on what you compare it with. So she was using national experts, and the national experts for the UK said, well, you have to compare Northern Ireland with Scotland and Wales. In that case, constitutional asymmetry was not very high. I was thinking, well, no, we have to compare with England. It's not a devolved entity, but it's there. And the risks of constitutional asymmetry about it bringing inequality and competition, well, it's there also. It's there especially if you take the English into account. I won the battle, at least for this PhD. I was a supervisor. What could she do? Anyway, the representation in Parliament discussion, I show you what the report said, already shows you that it is relevant to take the English into account. And also, she was also doing Iraq, but there was only one subnational entity with some autonomy there. And no one thought it was a problem then to compare with the rest of the country that had no autonomy. So that's why we chose to do it that way. Now, what are our observations? First of all, constitutional asymmetry, that's not new. It is dynamic. It increases and decreases, and that is because of that competition, of course. What we also see is that when we measure constitutional asymmetry, it is observed, high constitutional asymmetry is observed in particular in systems with low or medium overall autonomy. And also political asymmetry without or with low constitutional asymmetry in divided systems may lead to asymmetry in practice. So even if you have no constitutional asymmetry in practice, you may have it because of the differences between the different entities. For example, in Canada, Quebec will make much more use of its autonomy than the others. In South Africa, that would be Cape Town. So that is scope of asymmetry matters. What I think is you can give much more, much higher asymmetry if overall there is not so much autonomy to distribute in any case, then that's not really a problem. And that's why when the overall autonomy that is given is much higher, then constitutional asymmetry will also be there, but not really high, more like the Belgian size. Secondly, the process matters. Of course, constitutional asymmetry is a process. It increases and decreases, and it is mostly in the literature seen as upward or downward symmetrization. Upward symmetrization is because some underprivileged groups are dissatisfied, and then they want more powers as well, so that the overall status or powers are more equally divided. Then privileged groups want to keep the distinction, and so there is, again, downwards. They strive for more autonomy. Downward symmetrization will also be found if the government is very authoritative, as was the case in Russia and also China, or in times of crisis. You find some re-centralization. My hypothesis, and again, only hypotheses, are that cohesive processes are difficult, they are more burdensome, but they do carry a greater promise of stability. And so the question is, how cohesive is the process? And in a centralized process, subnational entities are not involved. In a bilateral process, everything depends on their bargaining position, what they get out of it. This is a process where the central government negotiates with every entity separately. And the cohesive process is a process where all actors are involved. And my take is that is the one that promises more stability, because if an entity is given more powers or more status, it is with the agreement of the others. Now, I don't have evidence for that, but I do have some, we did some research that gives some promising results. Lydia did not only look at, did not only measure constitutional asymmetry, she also tried to find out if there are features in the institutional design that brings about more or less asymmetry. And she looked at heterogeneous design of subnational entities. So if a separate subnational entity is in itself homogeneous or not. She looked at involvement of subnational or international actors in the constituent process, so that making it more cohesive. And she looked at whether the constitution in itself gave legal recognition for differentiated autonomy. And the institutional features that are most likely to produce a low degree of constitutional asymmetry is when the subnational entities have a heterogeneous design, when there is an involvement of subnational actors in the constituent process, and there is no legal recognition of differentiated autonomy. So there is no right to asymmetry, and so you get low constitutional asymmetry. And because of this involvement of subnational actors, hypothesis is the more cohesive, the lower the constitutional asymmetry will be. Institutional features that are most likely to produce a medium or even a high degree of constitutional asymmetry is when a limited distribution of differentiated autonomy is given to only a few subnational entities. For example, in the UK. If the constituent process is led by national actors, but they do so either in a centralized way through ordinary legislation or through bilateral agreements with every separate entity alone. And the design of the subnational entities is homogeneous. Again, what I see is that if the process is not very cohesive, that's when you get more constitutional asymmetry. My conclusion is that multi-tiered systems can be categorized based on the federal balance between autonomy and cohesion, and constitutional asymmetry can be measured as a difference in autonomy between the most and the least privileged parts. Multinationality determines the presence of constitutional asymmetry. So it is very common to have constitutional asymmetry if you have a multinational system, but not that alone. It is combined with other factors. And if you want to keep it stable, my hypothesis is that scope matters. Constitutional asymmetry is important, but very high asymmetry is bound to be more unstable if the overall autonomy is high, not so much if the overall autonomy is not so high. And secondly, the cohesive quality of the constituent process. If you take everyone on board, then of course you'll have a more stable process, but that is going to be also a very difficult process. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I forgot to inform that you are the author of one of the books of reference about asymmetry. That is, you are co-editor of the Constitutional Symmetry through an Empirical Lens. I think it's necessary to remind it. Next, we're going to have Professor Saputelli. She is the author also of several comparative studies, particularly analyzing the territorial entities in Italy and Spain, and also with France. Gabriella, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I have the... Yes, the... Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for this invitation. Yes, my presentation is about differentiated autonomy in Italy. So I will give you an overview of the constitutional framework, the recent developments and challenges. So I will give you, first of all, an overview of the constitutional framework by explaining the symmetries and asymmetries in the 1947 Constitution, and also on the evolution of this framework, specifically after 2001. But sure, I will focus on differentiated autonomy and on the recent developments of the implementation of the so-called asymmetry clause. And then I will conclude with some challenges in the current time. So a brief overview of the situation. Italy is a differentiated country from many points of view, geographic, history, language, and culture. So it's a long country with islands, mountains, borders. But the main point of difference now is the economy, because there is the richest part of Italy, which is located in the north of Italy. This is the most developed area, while is still unsolved the north-south divide, the so-called questione meridionale. So, in order to answer to this differentiation, in the Constitution of 1947, the founding fathers choose regionalism so regions were introduced besides local authorities, so provinces and municipalities. The two models of reference were the Spanish and the German model. And the cornerstone of this system was Article 5 of the Constitution. Still is the Article 5 of the Constitution, which is a fundamental principle, according to which the Republic shall be one and indivisible. It shall recognize and promote local autonomies and implement the fullest measure of administrative decentralization of those services which are provided by the states. So the Republic shall adapt the principles and methods of its legislation to the requirement of autonomy and decentralization. As a result, Italy is a unitary, regionalized system with symmetries and asymmetries at the same time. This is an overview of the territorial autonomies. We have municipalities, provinces, metropolitan cities that were introduced formally in 2001, but they were implemented really in 2014. And also 20 regions, so 15 ordinary regions and 5 special regions. So the symmetries and asymmetries that we can see in the constitutions and in the territorial system are related mainly to regions. Because the system of local autonomies is a asymmetric system, so they all have the same status and condition all over Italy. The 15 ordinary regions, they have the same status, the same competencies, and the discipline for the ordinary regions is in the Constitution, specifically in the Title 5 of the Constitution. While the 5 special regions the discipline are in this, they are listed in this Article 116 of the Constitution, but the main discipline is in their special statutes, which are adopted by constitutional law. They are all different, so special regions are all different, but among these regions, the situation of the Trentino Alto Adige Sud Tirol is more different than the other for the presence of these 2 autonomous provinces, which have the same competencies and autonomy of the regions. So the reasons for the introduction of the special regions were historical, geographical, they are on the borders or they are the 2 islands, and also the language, the differences among languages, the tradition, but also the need to compose some independent movements in the south and in the north. So mainly they are asymmetric from different point of view. First of all, the statutes, the source of the autonomy, they have a special statute which is adopted with a constitutional law, which is very difficult to change it. So it's not possible to reduce the constitutional, the autonomy granted. They have more and different competencies from the legislative and administrative point of view. For example, they all have competencies among the local autonomies, while the ordinary regions, they don't have this kind of competence. But mainly they have different and more resources and fiscal autonomy, which is called a fiscal privilege. And they have different relationships with the state, while the relationships are regulated and the implementation of the statutes are regulated by joint or peer commissions. But the situation changed in the 2001 when because of changes in the international, European, national context, there were two big constitutional reforms that changed the entire Title V of the Constitution. And these two reforms gave more competencies to regions, to ordinary regions, so more legislative competencies. For example, they now have formally the general competencies, while the state is reserved some competence. They were giving also statutory autonomy, so ordinary regions can have their own statutes, they can approve their own statutes, and they can choose the form of government. So after this change, what was the gap? What was which were the solution in order to reduce the gap between ordinary regions and special regions? So they had these problems to solve to reduce this gap. So two clauses were introduced. The first clause is dedicated to special regions, and according to this clause, the most favorable clause, special regions can enjoy all the new provision of the new Title V of the Constitution that provide a wider form of autonomy until the special statutes are up-to-dated. So for the special regions, we have to combine, in order to understand their autonomy, we need to combine the statutes and the Constitution. But the second clause, which is more discussed today, is the new possible asymmetry, so the asymmetry clause that was introduced in the paragraph 3 of the article, the same article that provide the special autonomy to special regions. According to this article that you can see here, additional special forms of a condition of autonomy that are related to many matters that are usually the concurrence matters, they can be attributed to other regions by a state law by following a specific procedures. And in this procedure, there can start with an agreement between the state and the regions. This agreement and this law has to comply with the principle of fiscal autonomy. So this clause has never been applied since 2018. Why? In the first decades after the constitutional reform of 2001, mainly the regions, they were attending the implementation of the new constitutional reform. After the economic crisis brought to a strong centralization process, and so as a reaction of this centralization process during the economic crisis, the most developed area of the country, so these three regions, formally activated the asymmetry clause in 2017 or 18 and signed preliminary agreement with the states. So these agreements raised a large debate on the legal problems related to the implementation of the asymmetry clause, as well as on the political, economic, and social implication of differentiated regionalism on the system, such as the unity and the equality. But in 2020, the COVID pandemic interrupted this process. As you can see, during this year, these three regions in red, they concluded the agreements, but also other regions, they started negotiations and discussion on the possibility to have more autonomy. So, but after the COVID pandemic, the questions seemed closed. However, it came against on the regional and political agenda with the change of the legislature, with the change after the recovery, when the new government took office in October 2022, that included the differentiated autonomy in the government reform program. But after the previous debate on the differentiated autonomy, this time the process did not start from the bottom, but was implemented from the top and followed two paths. First of all, a procedure for the determination of the minimum levels of benefit related to civil and social rights, and this is in order to ensure the principle of equality. And second, legislative proposal for the implementation of the asymmetry clause, which became later in June 2024, the law number 86. The law establishes the general principle for the attribution to ordinary regions of this new additional form of autonomy, and defines the procedure that has to be followed for the conclusion of the agreement. But there were many reactions to this law. First of all, a huge debate by the scientific community and a huge variety of opinions of the impact of this law. Then 4 regions in July 2024, 4 regions, Veneto, Piemonte, Liguria and Lombardy, submitted the request to start negotiations with the states. 4 other regions raised the question of constitutional legitimacy to the law before the Constitutional Court, and other regions proposed appeal ad opponendum against this question of legitimacy. And finally, citizens and 5 regions proposed abrogative referendum on the law. The most discussed development was the decision of the Constitutional Court on the question of legitimacy. The court decided in November with a long and complex judgment of more than 100 pages and 52 declarations. So basically, the court saved the law entirely, but declared some provisions of constitutional and reinterpreted other provisions. This judgment has been described as a treatise on regionalism, since it addressed many issues concerning the form of the state and the regionalism. It certainly marks a new direction for the asymmetry clause and maybe also for the regionalism. And because of the content of this judgment, the court was defined like a co-legislator. But certainly after this judgment, the law number 86 resulted heavily changed. So here there are some highlights of the principle established in this judgment. For example, the asymmetry clause was interpreted within the Italian form of the states and in connection with the unity of the people and the unity of the states. So the regionalism was defined as a cooperative regionalism, and within the important role of the principle of loyal cooperation. Secondly, it was highlighted in the judgment the fundamental role of the principle of subsidiarity that is the fundamental principle for the devolution of new competencies. According to this principle for the court, devolution cannot refer to subject or subject area, but only to specific functions. And the functions that we want to give to the regions, they have to be justified, motivated, and supported by very strong investigation and analysis. They have also met several criteria, efficiency, equity, effectiveness, accountability of the public authority, together with the need to respect international and European law. So according to those principles, there are functions that are very difficult to transfer, such as environment, energy, education. And the court goes through all this example in this long, complex judgment. Here there are some provisions that were declared unconstitutional by the court. For example, the applicability of asymmetry clause to special regions. If they wanted to have more competencies, they have to amend the constitutional statutes, the special statutes. Also, the procedure for the determination of the basic levels of rights and other provisions related to financial aspect and to the process. As a result, there is a limited space now for differentiated regionalism, and it seems that it's very difficult at that moment to realize all these conditions that are established by the court. What about the referendum? The request of referendum. 2 months later, like in 2 or 3 months later, the court decided also on the referendum and declared inadmissible the referendum of this law, on the law number 86, mainly because the subject and the purpose of the questions were unclear. In fact, after the previous judgment, the law number 86 was completely changed, was heavily affected. So this, according to the court, undermines the possibility of a free and informed choice by the voter. And the risk is that after the previous judgment, the people will express not on the law, but on the differentiated regionalism itself. But what about the negotiations between regions and the states that started in July 2024? In September, the State Regions Conference and the chambers were informed about these negotiations. The negotiations started formally the 3rd of October, but now they are in standby. They are probably in standby. We don't know anything about this process. So, which are the challenges now after these 2 important judgments of the court? There is an ongoing huge debate on the implications of the judgments of the court and on the law and on differentiated regionalism. The court decided some critical juridical issues. And as I already said, it acted like almost a co-legislator. But now it's the duty of the parliament to change the law and to fill the gaps related to some provisions that were declared unconstitutional by the court. So for now, the implementation of the differentiated regionalism is now in standby. As it is in standby, many crucial problems of the regionalism that are still unsolved, like the regional divide and differentiations between North and South and among regions, the problems of implementation of several constitutional provisions, such as the fiscal autonomy, the subsidiarity principle, the principle of equality. So the court highlights this lack, this problem of implementation in the judgment, as well as the implementation of the statutes of special regions, the lack of participation of regions in the state procedure, all things that were highlighted by Patricia Popelier in her presentation. That are necessary for a decentralized system. And also the last problem is that the regional systems are often in the hands of national parties. So some conclusions. The ongoing process and debate, so this is what I think, could be an opportunity to address the needs of territories and communities, and also to adapt the system to changes in the European and international context, even if now the situation is in standby. This is because the implementation of differentiated regionalism is profoundly linked with the dynamics and the implementation of regionalism. As also we were saying before, these initiatives of the regions were activated after the economic crisis and after the centralization process. So if all this debate, all this process will be useful to the effective implementation of regionalism and of the constitutional framework, for example, the fiscal federalism, by using all the instruments provided by the Constitution, it will be a great achievement. Because the main question, as the directors were saying, is that we need a better implementation of constitutional rights. And so I would like to conclude with this by posing the Article 5 of the Constitution. It is the fundamental principle related to territorial autonomies, where we can read that the Republic shall adapt the principle and methods of its legislation to the requirement of autonomy and decentralization, which is still there in the Constitution, has to be read with the Article 3 of the Constitution, paragraph 2, that provides for this principle of substantial equality. So it's the duty of the Republic to remove all the obstacles and to ensure the condition of equality all around Italy. So this is the main purpose of the all territorial system, all the discussion that we are having now in Italy. So here there are some few references among a huge debate that is going on many. There are many publications of these judgments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriella, for your presentation. Now the floor is open for the debate. If you have some questions or comments to present both to previous speakers, feel free.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for both of you. Patricia, I'm wondering whether this debate about symmetry and asymmetry has any relation with the intensity of, how would you say that, the integration of the system from the legislative perspective. Let's say that symmetry, if I'm an alien and I arrive and I think someone explains me symmetry from the perspective of allocation of powers, I would say, well, symmetry can provide you with a large margin of political diversity. Why not? I mean, the United States of America is an example of it. So whether asymmetry is more linked to systems based on an integrated perspective of legislation, because it's a guarantee of political diversity. You see, I mean, if Spain, Italy, Germany, whatever, if the central government, the federal government, is legislating the parameters of everything, to what extent as the need for political diversity is not linked to the need of asymmetry, because maybe it's too complex. Yeah, I see. Okay, symmetry can, from an objective perspective, can provide political diversity. Okay, so to what extent the demand of asymmetry is also linked to the lack of political diversity, because the federal government is intrusive. So to what extent, from a comparative perspective, this could be also linked to this. I mean, the more integrated is the system, the less political diversity can provide. So to what extent the debate goes to to asymmetries, because can be a way of protecting this right of autonomy.
I'm not sure if you need asymmetry for that. I think simply federalism will do the job. If you have entities with the power to have their own parliament, etc., you will have the regional parties for that as well. And it doesn't matter if it's symmetric or asymmetric.
Exactly.
That's quite the same. I'm just thinking now. In Belgium, we don't really have national parties. Well, the extreme left is a national party, but we only have regional parties and asymmetry. So I don't think that is really the link. But it's more a matter of well, as I said, multinationality is one. And if you have like a specific group that more than others has a very specific regional identity, you will have also political constellation around that, which will be strong in that region and not so much at the central level. And that will make it more difficult also to defend that position in a cohesive way, because you will not have so many allies at the central level. So that's where the political struggle starts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I have a question for you. I'm interested about the reason, the arguments of Tuscany and the other region to contest the law before the Constitutional Court. Why?
Well, yes, they contest. The other regions contested the law because of the impact that giving more competences and more resources to some regions sure, it impacts on the general system, because the system can be more complicated, and also the main question is about the fiscal autonomy. So some issues related to this issue is about the fiscal autonomy. So it is addressed by the Constitutional Court in the judgments. So the regions that can keep more competences, that they have to provide the resources for the other regions, for the unity of the system. So mainly is the impact on the general system. This is why for the first time the court approved also the other regions. Some regions challenged the law before the Constitutional Court, but other regions presented ricorso ad opponendum, so against the regions that raised the question of constitutionality, because there are some regions that wanted more competencies, other regions that they don't want the system to change. And also the question is political. It depends on the political parties that are in charge in the regions. The example is with the Emilia-Romagna, that in the previous attempt in the 2018, the Emilia-Romagna asked for more competencies, while this time it did not ask for more competencies. But it is in the same area, and it is a most developed region. So the Italian system, the Italian regional political system is very linked with the national system, political system. So many of the questions of the regions has to be read within the national parties.
Patricia. Perhaps I didn't understood very well, but I would like to know the burden you have given in your research particularly to the indicator of fiscal autonomy, because I mean, instinctively one would say that if you have a full fiscal autonomy, let's say the Basque Country in Spain, you're independently of the form of jurisdiction or competences you have, it will give you a greater power to develop your own self-government. I don't know if you have taken it into consideration.
Well, we looked at constitutional asymmetry in 3 dimensions, and we looked at what asymmetry score is in each of these dimensions. I don't know by heart what concrete outcomes were, but there is a difference in where they will give symmetry or not. Now, if of course autonomy is fiscal autonomy is important to develop your own institutions, but you can do that as well if you have not that autonomy but get the money from the central government. In Belgium, for example, there is in principle each community has a lot of autonomy. What we see is that for practical reasons, it's not used by the French and the Flemish community, which is why they get the money from the central level. The German-speaking community could raise their own taxes, but they don't use it. Why? Because it's much easier to have it from the central level. You don't have to go to your people and say, well, we want your money. You can just get the money and provide the services. So it's a bit more nuanced than that.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? So we are a bit in advance. I don't know, we could have now the coffee break. Would it be possible? Oh yes. Then let's have our coffee break.